thank you for coming up here. In the next hour, I'll try to cover an area of medicine which perhaps I will persuade you has been neglected for a while, and more recently has been linked very much to implications into society which were not perhaps appreciated in the past. The title I gave is exactly Sleep, Health and Society. And rather than going into the intricate mechanisms of sleep and the brain, I'll try to take you through some basic concepts and move it rapidly away from the brain and the biochemical markers straight into more mundane facts which link sleep to actual facts in our society. So the today point, in a sense, I will very briefly cover the question you might want to be answered: what is sleep? Of course, let's start from a definition. And then start to go to what is sleep for and why do we sleep? How much sleep we need? Do we need the set amount of time? Or perhaps you will answer the question yourself. We're all different. We all need different amount of sleep to work and function properly. But what about if we don't have enough sleep? And that's where I will start putting things in perspective. And I will really dwell into all possible consequences of less sleep than we would optimally need. And I use the word less because you will see in my talk I will use the terminology used in different literature over the years. We can talk about less sleep deprivation. We can see people talking about sleep curtailment or sleep debt, sleep deficit, sleep reduction. You can add anything. So I'll call it less sleep, just to be simple. And finally, I will spend some time to go into the more recent appreciations of the impact that less sleep might have on society as a whole rather than on rare disease conditions. So basics about sleep. Sleep is a universal phenomenon. Every single creature in the biological world needs sleep. Without sleep, we have death. Sleep serves a very important function, very briefly, is to allow an organism or a body to recover on a regular basis in order to restore the energy and all the resources necessary to go on. So it is a requirement for every single creature. And at the time of sleep, people feel that we are in a state of vulnerability. Everyone needs a sleep. How do we recognize sleep? Let's take sort of very basic approach. Most of us are familiar with this animal here. This is an awake cockroach. I hope you obviously appreciate it was awake. It's very obvious it's awake. Why is obvious it's awake? It's obvious when we see the cockroach asleep. Does anyone see the difference between these two cockroaches here in these two different conditions? This is up and about, the antennas are out, he's walking about, the head is up. Here, the head is down. Yes, collects all these legs very nicely. The antennas are all there. He's relaxed. And is this sleep? Who knows for the cockroaches? But just making the point, there are physical changes as well as biochemical and neurobehavioral changes in sleep. Let's very briefly go into the very complex areas so we can get away with it, and we go into more simple things. What is sleep? We can define sleep in different ways depending on how we want to take, which approach we want to take. Let's take the hard approach of assessing sleep as doctors do, and physicians and the physiologists do. That's by looking at a number of measures in different parts of the body. Now I'm taking the cat because this is common to many animals and to human beings, cats, dogs, and everything. We all sleep more or less in the same way. Although throughout our lifetimes, I'll show you, things change. But as a standard, we have an awake cat and a cat who's asleep. And the first thing to appreciate is sleep has two different characteristics. We have what we call a non-REM sleep phase versus a REM sleep phase. Now, how do we define what sleep is? This is an awake cat, and we have here some measures and some traces. I'll just tell you that these first three are measures of activities of different parts of our brain, which are taken with some electrodes we put on our skull. Then here, the EMG is a measure of the activity of our skeletal muscles, with some electrodes put in our muscles and see how much your muscle move and is in activity. The EOG is a measure of the movement of your eyes, the very fine movements, not the one we turn right and left. It's a very fine movement, so we can measure with some electrodes over here. And this is the ECG, which is the heart rate measurement. This, in whole one go, is what we call polysomnography, and usually we can set human beings with different electrodes and measure all these things whilst they're asleep. But what is interesting to see how these things vary, because this gives us an indication of the state of sleep. So we can have a non-REM sleep from an awake state, and you can see that some of these traces change significantly, particularly in the brain. We have a change in these activities, and these waves become very ample here, but not very frequent. So it's a slow, high amplitude waves with some complex here, some spindles, some K-complex known, very technical. But these tell us that this is a non-REM sleep phase. As you can see, at the same time as the animal is asleep, some of the other functions tend to slow down. There's less muscle movement, there's less eye movement, the ECG slows down slightly. Then we go into the REM sleep, and REM stays for rapid eye movement sleep. And if we look at these highlighted red traces here, the electrooculogram, so the movement of the eyes, you see that suddenly we have these very rapid eye movements, which is typical of a REM sleep phase. And alongside the REM sleep phase, and now refer back to the cockroach totally relaxed, you have almost total skeletal muscle paralysis. You're a total state of relaxation. And that is the definition of REM. And sometimes people think this is the deepest part of the sleep, but in fact it's probably the most superficial part. You can be woken up very easily here. Now these phases alternate across a typical night in a normal individual several times. Now technically this is sleep, all right? Having done that, I ask you to forget about it. One other thing I want to give you, and it's so complex that I will skip very quickly about it, is what regulates the sleep-wake cycle. Why do we get up while we fall asleep? That's very complex. Sits mostly in the brain and is regulated by three major mechanisms, which I won't go into detail, but if you see here, for those who are very keen, on this axis here, we have time of the clock time, 7 a.m., 11 p.m. here, and so forth. And here we have a degree of sleep propensity, so how far you're likely to fall asleep. And in different situations, you have, first of all, a body clock, which is very similar to the pacemaker we have in our heart, which does the impulse for the heart to beat. That starts on its own. For the same, in a similar way, has been described in a deeper part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that there is a particular body clock which clicks at a regular basis and starts the stimulus of wakefulness and sleep. And within that, there are a very complex system of hormones and regulations which tend to make us fall asleep. So you wake up from 7 o'clock, and your propensity to sleep goes up. At times goes by from very early on to late time until such a time when you fall asleep. And here is a circadian body clock which clicks and is also in part or in greater part regulated in a normal human beings by daylight and nighttime by assimilation and suppression of some hormones, one of which is called melatonin and is deep in our brain. And the other one is the architecture of our sleep as we go into different phases of sleep throughout the night. And every time we have more propensity to fall asleep, then we are again more vulnerable to wake up, and we sleep again until such a time that the threshold is so thin that eventually we wake up. Okay? I won't go into more details. It's already too complex. is a very complex system in our brain, most of which is still unknown. However, what I want to take you now into a more whole society type of framework and try to look at how much people sleep or have slept in the past and how the trend in the time that we spend asleep has changed over time. If I were to ask you all, do you think over the last 100 years we have increased our sleep time, we have slept always the same, or we have reduced our sleep time? What would you answer very quickly? Has gone down. Of course. Why do you think is that? Active lifestyle. The so-called 24/7 society. You go to the States, 70 late, 24 hours around the clock. You can do shopping on Sunday, 3 a.m. in any supermarket, even in the UK. So it's very obvious that we sleep less and less. The statistics do show that very clearly. This is a very simple graph. These are US data showing the average hours per night that Americans slept in 1910, 1975, 2005. And it's clearly, the bars don't look very different, but look at the number of hours on average in the whole population have gone down almost by 2.2 hours. So we've lost 2.2 hours. Is that good? Is that bad? We don't know. I'll try to persuade you that perhaps if you go too far, it's not too good. But at the moment, there is side of the society that tells you that we don't need to sleep too much because we can do other things. We could be more productive. We could enjoy our life more. We can indulge in more fun, whatever. Is that due to just work? Well, this is a similar graph to one before. These are 1998 to 2005. And if you look at the continuous lines here, we have the number of hours, the proportion of people who have slept less than 6 hours, they sleep less than 6 hours a day or more than 8 hours a day. So green being a longer sleep, red being less sleep, okay? Traffic light mechanism. So the amount of people who were sleeping 8 hours or more has declined throughout the years. And at the same time, as a consequence, those who sleep less have increased. But what is interesting, if you look at the same pattern at weekends, you find the same pattern. There's been a decline in sleep time at weekends and an increase in the proportion of people who sleep less at weekends, suggesting that perhaps it's not just the pressure of work that has led to reduction in sleep hours, but perhaps it's more of a cultural shift we have. That even on weekends, we try not to sleep too much. We want to do something else. Let's get up at 9 o'clock to play golf. Let's get 7 o'clock to go to the seaside, and things like that. So it may not be just work. What I showed you is mainly American data. And I'm very keen to accumulate more and more UK data. The more I look at it, the less I find it. Obviously, all these issues are related to society, cultural background, the infrastructure of the society itself. So it would be very useful to have UK-based data on which perhaps to build similar comparisons with the US, or perhaps to draw some differences with US. Now, this is one of the very few studies I've picked up at the population level, trying to address how much British men and women sleep. And this is based on self-reported duration of sleep, something we will test in a few minutes with yourselves. People were asked, how many hours on average do you sleep at night? And that was what we put it here. And this is the proportion of people for men and women. And you can see very simply what is the average. On average, UK men and women sleep around 7 hours per night. The Americans, 6.8. So we know roughly, as a populations, we're not dissimilar. But within populations, an average means, of course, what is concealed is a huge variation of the so-called the short sleepers, 5 hours or less. It's quite a significant proportion of people, as much as the long sleepers. And I think this is puzzling also lots of scientists and physiologists to understand the characteristics of the people who sleep too much, perhaps. So, on average, 7 hours, but some significant variability around that. Now, how important is sleep? Now, I want now to start showing what the change in sleep patterns throughout our life cycles, and then put in perspective what can be wrong if we sleep less. And let's start from when we're born. Obviously, sleep is very important. Most of you have had children, know how important sleep for newborn babies is, or more so how important it is for the parents. Because most of us have gone through sleepless nights, realizing, and then having very quiet days, where the baby is very, very sleepy throughout the whole day, and he wakes up at night and can't sleep. So newborn babies and infants have totally different patterns of sleep compared to adults. And they have three different stages you don't find in adults. Now I won't go into details about these particular characteristics. But they sleep about 16, 18 hours a day. And what they do, they alternate regular sleep-wake over 24 hours period. And as the next slide I have later will show, yes, this one, is at the beginning, obviously they don't differentiate between daytime and nighttime, whether or not there's light, until much later. These are the number of hours, the mean hours of sleep in children under the age of 4, in total. That's the yellow line. So we're looking at a slight decline in the first 4 hours of life. But what is interesting, that this decline is due to a decline mostly in daytime sleep to the benefit of more hours of nighttime sleep, going towards the trend of the normal pattern. So that's what infants and children do. So perhaps the young parents will help you understand what the problems might be when you have your kids not sleeping much. As you grow, then the patterns change slightly. There's a gradual drop in total sleep, as I showed you, and also a rephasing of daytime sleeping. And by the age of 10, it is gathered that you need about 10 to 11 hours of sleep. Now, one thing is very important, and that has been shown that teenagers need particularly more sleep than adults, around the 8 to 9 hours per night. But in a modern society, studies have shown they don't get it. And let me show you some experience from the Americans, as we don't have many data. Right, before I do that, the other thing is very important in the pattern of growth with time from birth up to 10 years. The other thing you need to appreciate to understand the pattern that for the first 2 or 3 years, very young children nap a lot. And the nap is a mechanism to rapid recovery from sleepiness and tiredness and exhaustion. But as we grow, we lose very rapidly that habit. So that by the age of 6, 7, there's hardly any napping as a natural phenomenon. And only do you find that in these circumstances here. And we'll see. Now, we're talking about the adolescents and the fact that teenagers need more sleep than adults. They don't get it. This is one of the very recent American polls. This is a 2006 Sleep in American poll, which they run it every year on the entire population of the US, on a very large sample of the entire population of the US. And every year, they choose a particular topic for specific action. Sometimes children, sometimes elderly, sometimes depressed people, sometimes couples, youngsters, and so on. But they screen all the population, big sample. And this is on the adolescents. And what you have here is a study of children and adolescents between the 6th and the 12th grade, which is roughly between 12 and 18 years of age. And we have here clock time in 4 different situations. The black line is the wake time they have. And you can see between 12 and 18, they almost wake up at the same time. Because they have to get ready to leave house to go to school around 7:15. Because obviously the starting time for school is around 8 o'clock for all of them across, between 12 and 18. They all follow the same routine. What they did not do, however, is to go to bed at the same time. As you get older, of course, you stay up longer and longer, So rather than going to bed at 9 o'clock p.m., you end up 1 hour 18 and going after 11. Is that natural? Is this because these people need less sleep than these youngsters here? Well, they were also asked, do you think you get enough sleep for what you need? And that's what they answered. This is the proportion of children in the different grades who said they get less sleep than they need. So they felt they didn't have enough sleep. And surprise, surprise, it goes up with age. So those who are going to bed later, 3/4 of them said they didn't have enough sleep. Now, this is a reality. It's not that it has any cause or effect. We can argue what is causing this. It's society, pressure, maybe they work more, they play PlayStation, whatever. This is what is happening. They're sleeping less, but they say they haven't got enough sleep. Very torturous situation, very difficult. So I put that in the context for now. Before moving forward, I've decided I want to do a little interactive test, if you don't mind. And there are two particular questions we will do tonight and ask you to take part in answering. How many hours do you sleep each night? If you feel on average, not tonight or yesterday because you had something, on average, do you sleep 5 hours or less? In that case, you press 1. If it's between 6 and 7 hours at night, you press 2. If it's 8 hours or more, please press 3. Aha, right. The answer is we have the majority, by far, sleep between 6 and 7 hours, which is almost on spot on average for the UK. We have some long sleepers. A quarter of you are long sleepers. I won't ask you who. And let me see this area here, 8% only, which, two people. That's the number of people voted. Amongst you, there are 2 people who perhaps don't sleep enough. Okay? Now, for those 2 in the red, I don't want to know who they are. Just keep it in mind. Then we will put in perspective what that might mean for you. If we can go to the next exercise. So remember that, if I can write it down, is 8%. 2 people. The next one is an exercise which should refer to a leaflet you have been handed. And I hope you can read it. I'll give it. This is the one that has on the top Epworth Sleepiness Scale score. Okay, if I can guide you through this, and I hope you have a pen and a pencil. I won't read your thing. No, don't worry about this. It's just, it will be anonymous again. I would like you to concentrate and answer this particular question. During the last week, rate how likely you were to doze off or fall asleep during the following situations we will read in a second. And if you do not recognize you being likely to fall into that situation, can you answer as if you were in that situation anyway? So to make it simpler. And the way I want you to answer is to score each of these 8 situations for that question with either a 0, which means you would never doze off in those circumstances, with a 3, if you feel there is a very high chance that you would doze off in those circumstances, or 1 and 2 if you had a slight or moderate chance. And the situations are, if I read it one at a time, so I'll guide you, when sitting and reading, how likely are you to doze off? Can you please just write your rating between 0 and 3? How likely are you, would you be whilst you're watching television to doze off? Sitting inactive in a public place like this one, theater, a meeting, how many of you are falling asleep whilst I'm talking? Bad for me. Number 4, as a passenger in a car for an hour without a break, would you be likely to doze off? And if you'd never a passenger, just think about if you were a passenger in the car, would it be likely for you Now, number 5, lying down to rest in the afternoon. Number 6, sitting and talking to someone. It's quite embarrassing, but anyway. 7, sitting quietly after lunch, bearing in mind without having had alcohol. That would confound my, so don't attribute to alcohol, sleepiness. In a car while stopped in traffic. Okay, there would be 8. Have you put a number between 0 and 3 in each of the 8 boxes? We all have done it. Now, can I ask you the last exercise? Can you add up those scores in the final box as a total score, please? And keep it for yourself for now. That's fine. Is that right? Okay. Once all have done that, I'll click the next one, and then perhaps you can, or you have your own. And then I will ask you with a little gadget again. Get a little gadget again. And if your score is 10 or less, would you vote 1? If your vote is between 11 and, what was it, 14, I think? 11, 14, yep. Please press 2. If it's 15 or more, please press 3. Right, hooray. So we have, okay, 19 or 10 or less. And then we have above 10, we have 5 people amongst you who have rated as 11 or more. Now, let me just write it down this. What's the proportion? Would be 8, 12 is more than 20%, 1 in 5, isn't it? Yeah, 5 people will be 1 in 5. Thanks very much. Right, I think what we have done in the last 5 minutes is to assess, for all of you as a population of this theatre, what is your average sleep time, which is one of the variables you have seen many times on the slides I've showed you. And we have picked about 8% of you, not a lot, perhaps do not get enough sleep because they're below the average for the UK. It's 5 or less hours a night. Now, it may well be that you cope perfectly well with the 5 hours, and on an individual basis, it's very difficult to ascertain whether it's right or wrong. But I'll show you perhaps on aggregate data at the population level how much difference there might be on some of the implications of a less sleep of 5 hours compared to 6 or 7, for instance. And the second exercise we have done is in a very simple way, but it's very scientific, because that particular ESS score that you've just done is something that is very commonly used in clinical practice and in psychology as a non-invasive, very simple preliminary test to assess excessive sleepiness, which I want to introduce it to you now. And excessive sleepiness of some degree is anything of a score of 11 and above, which, putting in perspective, the 5 of you have scored tonight that in a graded, the 3 and 2, which makes about 20% if we were representative of anything today. So 1 in 5 of you may suffer from excessive sleepiness. And this is the second part of the talk I want to introduce to you, is the consequences of not sleeping enough, which we call excessive sleepiness. Now, it's very obvious and counterintuitive. If you don't sleep enough, and we don't know how much enough is enough for individuals, but we have set it within the context of the average mean of the population. If you don't sleep enough, obviously, you start accumulating some sleep debt, or you start becoming sleep deprived. If you do it over and over and over again, is there anything that happens to you, anything goes wrong? Now, the one thing that happens for sure, and that you suffer of sleepiness during the day. And that's been shown, and that's what we call excessive sleepiness. And this is a nice picture that I was telling one of my colleagues just arrived from London, Trevor. This is a painting from Charles Bogham. He's a contemporary American artist, which is displayed in the Firehouse Gallery of Wichita in Kansas, very famous museum. But this, the title of this canvas is Excessive Daytime Sleepiness. And I'm not sure whether this painter has some scientific knowledge, or I just call it out of the blue like this. What is excessive sleepiness? The daytime, I would probably read it in brackets, because traditionally, if you sleep at night, your sleepiness, if you don't sleep enough, or the excessive sleepiness is during the daytime. But we may see that if you are a shift worker and then working mostly during the night, and you ought to sleep during the day, you might suffer from excessive sleepiness at night when you are supposed to be awake. So let's call it excessive sleepiness. Sleepiness is a biological drive state of decreased ability to maintain wakefulness, or, in other words, an increased propensity to fall asleep. But excessive sleepiness is something slightly different. It is a symptom of difficulty maintaining wakefulness and an increased propensity to fall asleep, even in inappropriate circumstances. And that questionnaire you filled in has listed a number of inappropriate circumstances. Standing in the traffic whilst you're driving and you're falling asleep, that's quite inappropriate, isn't it? You can, in the best possible scenario, you'll be booted for not seeing the green light, but in the worst possible scenario, you can crash into somebody else's. So, and that would interfere with activities of daily living. And I'll give you an extreme example. Okay, let's see what the consequences are of excessive sleepiness, or sleep disturbance and sleep deprivation. We have two slightly different terminologies here. I've introduced you sleep deprivation, which could be sleep debt, curtailment, reduction, less sleep, less quantity of sleep. So insufficient sleep. But we may also put at the same level, in terms of impact, the so-called sleep disruption. And I haven't showed you many data around that, but it's enough to give you an example that if your partner snores, which is also related to sleepiness in some stage, but if your partner snores, you don't sleep very well, don't you? How many of you know that? And that's where you have a disrupted sleep. You don't suffer from snoring, but you suffer from sleep fragmentation, because you wake up all the time trying to fall asleep. And that is as bad as not sleeping enough. Anyway, we call it fragmented sleep. And both these situations would lead, if sustained over a significant period of your lifetime, a week, 2 weeks, a month, a period of your life, to suffering from excessive sleepiness. The excessive sleepiness has been shown to lead to major problems. In a nutshell, it's a neurobehavioral deficits. Okay, let's list some of these nasty neurobehavioral deficits. What are they? For instance, lack of concentration during the day, lack of attention, not being very alert, having an impaired cognitive function, ability to execute functions, doing things. The working memory may be impaired during the day. These are things that if you think about it, and every one of you can figure out some period of their lives where they haven't slept enough for a long period of time, you start seeing that, oh yes, right, I've suffered from that for a certain period of time. And the other would be performance deficits, more practical things. It would be less accurate if you were to do some work. And you will be more prone to errors. And I'll put it into context in a second of what errors may mean and what are trivial errors that could be totally overlooked and what could be more important errors that we ought not to overlook or brush under the carpet. Because these things eventually have been shown to lead to, first of all, I'll put it first, a decreased quality of life. Yeah, sometimes a misery in reality. But also to increase morbidity, which in lay words means an increase in the occurrence of disease. Could be trivial diseases, could be irreversible diseases, could be more serious chronic conditions, as I'll show you. And eventually, it's likely but not absolutely proven, that may lead to an increase in mortality. Not completely shown. Okay, excessive sleepiness, errors, lack of accuracy, cognitive function, neurobehavioral deficits. Okay, these are unfortunate pictures which I'm going to show and collect, and this is quite standard way in which experts in sleep medicine portray the bad side of lack of sleep. And these, some of you may recognize this picture because a couple of weeks ago, we as a world were not celebrating but remembering the 20th anniversary of this disaster. These are the 4 units that blew up in Chernobyl, in Ukraine, killing more than 100 people on the spot. They caused the death of an extra 100 and odd people trying to help. And has been estimated now to kill or to have killed with the radiations in excess of 4,000 people in the immediate area. And who knows what is the death toll over the following 100 years or so in a larger area for the fallout of the nuclear material that came out of this disaster. Now, this, as many others, which I'll just very briefly list at the same time here, this is the Challenger. You remember? The space shuttle who blew up on takeoff and killed 7 astronauts. This is the Bhopal chemical disaster in India that killed people. Terrible views here. This is the Exxon Valdez disaster, the oil tanker, the crash off the coast of Alaska, creating a huge environmental disaster with a spill of a lot of petrol and oil for thousands of miles in the coast. And this is another nuclear incident of lesser proportion, unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, where these 2 reactors released some nuclear substance across the air, causing some death. Now, all these are put together, and these are the most renowned. And if you see, somebody made me notice this morning whilst I was looking at these, they all date about 20 years or more. There are more recent ones. Why am I not listing them? Now, these are the ones that all have completed full inquiries and reports, which may take 20 years, as you can imagine. And they have shown as a significant component of the disaster, it may not be the only one, but a significant component, blaming excessive sleepiness of workers at the time of their duties. Right? Particularly for the Valdez, was the chap driving the thing, was falling asleep and things like that. There may be other reasons, but these have been proven to have something to do with excessive sleepiness of staff and workers related to the maintenance of these things, which have contributed to the disaster. Closer to home, what else could excessive sleepiness cause? And I mentioned if you drive your car. If you drive your car, you fall asleep whilst you're driving your car. You can harm yourself, you can harm others. And if your job is to drive, if you're a lorry driver, and you don't sleep enough, if you suffer from excessive sleepiness, this is what happens. And it happens over and over and over again. Just for you, the Selby disaster, do you remember that? That's particularly cunning because the dynamic was so different from the others. This is a chap on a Land Rover, hadn't slept for 36 hours, then set off to go home. He fell asleep on the wheel, and on a bridge, he went off the road. Unfortunately, he went down this ditch on the railway. At the same time, a speedy train was arriving, killing other people. So it's a sequence of attempts. The only thing happened because he fell asleep at the wheel and hadn't slept enough, and many others. And this is now quite clear that alongside also some particular medical conditions whereby people can suffer from sleepiness, like a condition called sleep apnea syndrome, which is also related to being very heavy, and lorry drivers usually are big. So there is now there's a requirement for lorry drivers to be tested for sleepiness, but it's only very recent, not only to protect themselves, but to protect the public. Okay, few facts for you to take home. 20% of accidents on motorways are caused by excessive sleepiness. These are national figures. About 300 people a year are killed where a driver has fallen asleep at the wheel. The Selby is an excessive example, but it happens every day. The estimated cost is very underestimated, in excess of £1 million. Now, one thing I mentioned, I'll show you something else, is the shift work sleep disorders. People who work shift hours, by changing their sleeping patterns and habits, are more susceptible to sleepiness if they don't have proper shifts and proper time to recover and sleep. And about 10% in our society of these workers suffer from proper sleep disorders related to their shift work. Unfortunately, I want to put off the medical profession. I'm part of it. But so far, one thing would be very important for us to understand is the implication of sleep medicine and sleep disturbances. And here we are in the 21st century, and in medical schools in the UK, and I can tell you that, on average, only 5 minutes, sometimes between 5 and 20 minutes, in the whole medical curriculum is devoted to sleep medicine. Okay? So I think we need to do something about it. I'll tell you what we're doing at Warwick in a second. And then we have some medical conditions leading to disturbances of sleep and excessive sleepiness. The most important being, the most common being the obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. And these are rarer, and I don't think I want to give you that these are not important, but these are rarer and are part of the medical interests where you are referred to people. The important is, first of all, if we haven't got enough training in the medical profession, we are unlikely to pick them up. But second, they only represent a small proportion, but the most important impact of sleepiness is in people like you and me, who may not be ill or carrying any particular disease, but just being affected in some parts of our lifetime to this dangerous condition of excessive sleepiness. Let me show you one particular example, beautiful example, tested in the States very recently, on the effect of sleep deprivation and excessive sleepiness in doctors. I'm saying you would like to know. And then I'll ask you the question later. This is a beautiful study in Boston where they took a series of doctors and underwent a proper study, taking two groups of doctors, one undergoing what they call the traditional schedule of extended over 24 hours shift. And what they do, these are three doctors, the schedules. They have an extended 24 hours sleep, followed by a recovery, and then another round of 24 hours on call. Well, what they call every third night, because if you see this dotted line, this is midnight. There are 1 night on call, 1 night off, 1 night off, 1 night on call. So every 3 nights, there are 1 on call. And these are 24 hours or more hours of continuous duty. And they compared their function and activities and efficiency to a different group of doctors who had been set on a different schedule, what they call the intervention schedule. This is aiming at improving. The hypothesis was it was too bad. And these doctors had not only a reduced on-call time, consecutive on time, no more than 14 hours, but in addition, they had a total amount of hours per week, which was less than those. So less time on duty and a reduced extended hours continuously on call. They went on and were observed for a long period of time, and lots of things were measured. And I'll show you two things: the risk of the traditional schedule to patients and the risk of the traditional schedule to self-harm, to the people and to yourself. I don't want you to read this table. I'll guide you through. This is a comparison. This is the occurrence of serious medical errors that were counted over the period of observation that occurred under the traditional schedule for doctors compared to the intervention schedule, which is the one that is working less hours. And what I'll show you here, sorry if I do my back, so I can't see. Right. First of all, look at the serious medical errors. This group here had 36% more medical errors compared to the intervention schedule, which is the reduced working hours. At the same time, 57% more non-intercepted serious errors. In other words, no one picked it up, those errors, whilst they were on call. There was no other safety net. The nurse didn't pick it up. No one picked it up. They were 50% more common amongst these doctors under 24 hours or more shift than these. What kind of medical errors were they? You would be interested in that, because although we're not specialists, what you want to know a doctor to give you the right drugs and make the right diagnosis. Those are the two important things the doctors do. Here we are, 21% more likely to give you the wrong drug and 5 times more likely to give you the wrong diagnosis. So tired, sleepy doctors are dangerous. That has been very revealing in the American field. They did not believe this would ever happen, and they showed it. What about self-harm? They had the great ability to follow these doctors whilst they were off the shift. And in America, as also here now, no one goes home on foot. We all drive our car back home. And this is the amount of accident crashes or near-miss accidents in the car for the doctors coming off the extended work shift hours compared to the non-extended shift hours. And just look at these two things. These numbers mean this is 2.3 times greater chance of crashes in this group, and on nearly 6 times greater chance of near-miss accidents when going home. So these doctors, overstretched, overworked, do put their lives at risk as well. These are now quite accepted data. We're now importing these with the same group. We're working with this group to try and implement this in the UK if possible. Now, the last part of my talk, I'm aware is 5 to 7, but I'll take about 10 minutes if you don't mind, going through what's the important implication of short sleep duration with 3 major conditions which affect our society: high blood pressure, diabetes, and obesity. Okay, I'll guide you through these. This is the This is the time trend of the development of the occurrence of hypertension over time. High blood pressure has increased from the 50s to the 90s. Likewise, diabetes is on the rise very dramatically, and obesity is on the rise. Now here today, Patricia Hewitt is telling us we should now treat obesity more seriously because it is a health hazard for the population as a whole. So all these conditions have gone up with time. Do you remember what sleep duration did with time? Went down. So what? Well, let's see. Is there any link, any association? Now I'll show you 3 pieces of evidence which suggest there may be a link. And in one particular case, we also know what the possible mechanism might be. This is a study looking at hours of sleep in relation to the occurrence of high blood pressure over time. And those who sleep less than 5 hours, the 8% of you, might be at a greater risk of developing high blood pressure compared to those who sleep 7 to 8 hours on average. So there is an association between the duration of sleep and the risk of developing high blood pressure. Why is that? I won't go into great detail. There are possible mechanisms. When you are asleep, as I showed you, you relax, your relaxation, the muscle relaxation contributes to a fall in blood pressure, what we call a nocturnal dip in blood pressure. Your blood pressure falls at night because you relax, your muscle relaxes, and also your activity of the nasty hormones, the adrenaline and noradrenaline, settles down, and that reduces the blood pressure. If you are longer awake, you have less of that, which would be a greater burden to your cardiovascular system, therefore perhaps predisposing to more vascular disease. How about diabetes? This is a latest study showing that when you sleep less, your risk of diabetes is almost twice as high as if you sleep 7 hours. So there is a hunch here that also diabetes may be associated to slow duration of sleep. The puzzling thing is this group here. Why long sleepers also have high diabetes, we don't know yet. The mechanisms for the explanation of the low sleep may rely on a number of mechanisms, which I'll go into details when I talk about the next one, which is obesity. You know how many of us suffer from that? Why do we get this? And has got sleep anything to do with it? Let's see. I'll show you earlier how obesity is on the increase over time in adults. And this is just the same thing. Got different age groups and the average over time here, years. What I want you to concentrate is on the dotted lines now. These are 3 groups of 2 to 5 years old, 6 to 11, and 12 to 19 in green. You can see since the 80s there's been a sharp rise in the prevalence of obesity in children and adolescents. And this is a real serious problem for us. It will lead to an epidemic of diabetes, of hypertension, and heart disease. Beyond that, however, what also happens, that we find that when we link the proportion of children who are either overweight or obese with the hours they sleep, surprise, surprise, the less they sleep, the more obese they are. And this is the age of 5 and 6. And it's not a chance finding. It's been repeatedly found in different populations across Europe and the United States, Japan and Taiwan. And it's consistent and it's true. Why should we be more obese as we sleep less? That, I think, is going into the right direction, so we are very heavily interested in. 2 hormones change with duration of sleep. One hormone called leptin goes down as you sleep less, and the hormone called ghrelin, conversely, goes up as you fall asleep, as you reduce your sleep time. What these hormones do? Be reassured, I'll guide you through this. This is a very nice picture, but just to show that everything happens in the brain. The regulation of sleep, as well as the regulation of appetite, hunger, happens in the brain. What we have 2 particular hormones. One's called leptin, which is produced by the fat cells in our body, which is produced by the fat cells and conveys information to the brain on the amount of energy that there is stored in our fat tissue. So that when there is enough fat here, the leptin will give a message to the brain to shut down the intake of energy by food, so we'll reduce appetite, reduce hunger, and we'll also give a message to the brain to burn out more energy. And if you think of a seesaw mechanism, the ghrelin, which is produced by the stomach, works exactly in the opposite direction. Still on the brain, on a different area, but linked to the previous one, so that it will stimulate appetite in the right conditions. So the lack of sleep, as I showed you earlier, from one side seems to reduce leptin, so giving less of a stoppage message to the brain to stop eating. At the same time, in the seesaw mechanism, pushes ghrelin up, which tells the body to eat more. And the net result of this is an increase in appetite as this shift in ghrelin to leptin ratio occurs as a result of sleep deprivation. You see, this is a study where people were deprived of sleep, ghrelin and leptin were measured, and also their hunger and appetite was measured. And the less the leptin and the higher the ghrelin was, the greater was the appetite in those who were sleep deprived. And this is one possible mechanism which might explain the relation between less sleep and more obesity. Now, to conclude the last 2 slides, one is to put in the context of excessive sleepiness within the general society. I've showed you that. The impact it might have on children, not only to be linked to obesity very early on, but also to reduce bonding activities by lack of energy. For the same token, relationship with friends and colleagues may be impaired by excessive sleepiness. Remember, excessive sleepy people are not as productive as more awake and alert people, and this may eventually hinder career prospects. And the partner's relationship has been proven also to be impaired by regular chronic excessive sleepiness. I wish to conclude with messages to take home, and these are my messages. I'm perhaps over-enthusiastic in calling it the silent epidemic, because I want to make you aware and go home feeling that you've learned something and no one else knows. But there is an epidemic of excessive sleepiness, which can have, I hope I've persuaded you with some evidence, may have profound consequences for the individuals affected, but also for the society in general. I told you, without putting off medical profession, that more time should be given to the teaching of sleep medicine in today's medical school. And I will assure you locally that Warwick Medical School is doing a lot, because we already run a special study module for students, providing about 20 hours in the year 2 of sleep medicine teaching. So we are well above all the others. And we are developing a postgraduate program for doctors. But that is unique. It is not widespread across the country. More emphasis should be given to sleep medicine amongst healthcare professionals and the general public. I do believe that the pressure from below will help making the system come to pace with the need for more attention to it. And more research should be carried out, and we're doing this, to understand the mechanism by which short sleep is linked to what are the commonest chronic conditions in our Western societies. I mentioned hypertension, diabetes, and obesity, amongst others. But mainly are the most important risk factors for heart disease and stroke in our society. And sleep deprivation, curtailment, death, or less sleep, in inverted commas, may play an important role with that. And I'm just pinching one of my colleagues' statement in one of his reviews, that it is time to wake up to the importance of sleep medicine. I think I just want to conclude by acknowledging the help of my team and my colleagues in the studies we are doing. Thanks very much. That's 5 minutes.
Can I ask, do you know what the secret is to a power nap? These people that claim to be able to sleep for about 15 minutes and feel completely revitalized and fresh.
Yeah.
I always feel terrible. I'm one of the people that dozes off frequently
Yeah.
in that chart.
Yeah.
And if I do doze off, particularly at an inappropriate time, I feel horrible afterwards.
Yeah. No, there are studies which are showing very clearly that napping appropriately with a proper rate of napping is good, particularly for freshening up yourself and making sure you can go through the day. These things are useful and been shown to be helpful in going through the life. They are not extremely, although they are used as hygienic measures, they shouldn't be relied upon very heavily should you be in the conditions of driving, for instance, where obviously there will be a false reassurance that you have recovered completely. So there is, as long as the message is clear, yes, napping, it is recommended as one of the hygienic measures, amongst others. I think there is a leaflet that will circulate perhaps on the way out on the hygienic measures to improve good sleep. Obviously, not having your TV in your room, not having coffee or heavy alcohol drink at night before going to sleep, and so forth. There are a number of recommendations. Napping is one thing, but provided it is not taken as false reassurance in critical conditions where risk is impaired, because that will not cover up for the significant sleepiness that might occur if you are driving in a heavy good vehicles or you're operating a heavy machinery or you are a doctor on call. Sleep medicine is it's not a specialty, in fact, in our country. Is the knowledge of that disturbances of sleep patterns, duration, quality, and so forth, may have on health. And different specialties at the moment in our country deal with sleep problems in isolation. For instance, the typical specialty that does most of it is the respiratory physicians, because they deal with patients with sleep apnea syndrome. The patients suffocate, snore, they're heavy, they have apneas, so lack of breathing moments during the night, which is associated with a lack of oxygen to the brain. And that is associated with daytime sleepiness, but also with long-term problems like cardiovascular disease, hypertension, stroke rates, and so forth. And they end up to the respiratory physician first because they snore. The other category of disease patients are the maxillofacial surgeons, because the people snore and they think there's a problem with their mouth. And so they see as a first point of referral. Then the neurologists may see people with narcolepsy, because they have very overt symptoms of falling asleep, and that may mimic epilepsy, may mimic other conditions need to be. But in reality, sleep medicine goes just beyond, as I hope I've showed you, beyond those rare medical conditions, which I haven't even mentioned. They would have gone on for hours. So sleep medicine, in a sense, like public health medicine. What do we mean by public health medicine? Is awareness as sleep is one of the variables in lifestyle behavior that ought to be taken into account when assessing an individual and the fitness of an individual within the society. Why do we measure blood pressure? No one feels ill with a high blood pressure until they get a stroke. We now believe we ought to measure blood pressure because that predicts who is going to develop a stroke. We can reduce blood pressure with drugs, for instance, and we can save lives. Why don't we measure sleep in people? That is the concept of sleep medicine in the widest range. It could be tackled by everyone, from public health to cardiologists to some more awareness and teaching of the problems of sleep. Yeah, well, when I say the medical profession, I include GPs. I don't exclude them because that's the first protocol. And sometimes I'm not talking about the overt mechanisms of very ill people with obstructive sleep apnea syndrome or narcolepsy, but the very subtle problems of sleep, which have to be revealed by interviewing, by knowing the patient. Usually, the first protocol for people to identify those problems should be the GPs, in fact. So I think you're right in what is happening now. Doesn't mean it's right what is happening. There are. Sure. Well, it's better than nothing. Yeah. I mean, ideally, would be the regulars. Yes, the question was, if you have not enough sleep during the week, and a weekend you try to catch up by sleeping longer, is that good or bad, or does it do anything? Definitely it's not bad. It's better than nothing, I was going to say. If you can do that, yes. The problem is if you do that in a long period of time, your debt, your sleep debts accumulated over the week may not be just paid back by the weekend. And it's the daytime sleepiness during the week that will not be averted. So I think it's more of, and those who really study the shift patterns, the circadian variation, the adaptation of the body clock to different conditions like pilots, overhaul pilots, or other or astronauts or other categories of people who really are exposed to huge variations in adaptation to the body clock. They know that there is a given pattern for different people that cannot be totally reverted by just catching up. So catching up is good, but it's not the solution. Otherwise, we will give it just a weekend off to doctors, and that's it. That doesn't work like that. Cataplexy. That is one of the features of advanced stages of narcolepsy, in fact, with or without cataplexy, when you just lose complete. That is a very severe condition, which falls into the medical conditions, which probably neurologists treat most of the time. And I don't think I'm the best person to answer that question. That it falls in that a small proportion of patients, which I deliberately averted to mention, don't to give the wrong impression sleep medicine is something for a minority of patients might suffer. I just want to bring alive the idea that not sleeping enough is our problem for the majority of people. That was my task tonight. But you're right, that is a duty for neurologists to study. It's a severe condition, which can be the extreme level of narcolepsy. When you basically, your threshold to fall asleep is very minimal. As soon as you're told to fall asleep, you fall asleep. Sometimes people just fall to the floor. Right. Yeah, maybe these are rare conditions which we don't treat at the moment, so I can't answer that. Yeah. Yes, you do. Yes. Cataplexy. Yeah. You have paralysis.
Body
Yeah.
loses its muscle tone. So effectively, during that period of sleep, we're paralyzed. And you know, sometimes you may have dreamt of running away from someone, but
Yeah.
you're not getting anywhere. That's probably part of this REM sleep. And it's
Yeah.
a bit like cataplexy is like this REM sleep
Extended.
extending into the wakeful state.
Yeah.
So you're awake, aware of your surroundings.
Yeah.
You can't move because it's like
Yeah.
an episode of REM sleep during the wakeful state.
And if I can add to that, I did mention that the REM sleep, although people feel is the deepest sleep, because when you dream, in fact, is the most superficial one. It's one you can be woken up immediately. And that's a bit of the secrecy of the sleep and dream. And so it's not the profound sleep, it's a very superficial one. And lots of things happening, as it says, including muscle paralysis. Yeah. One more.
This is the last
The last one.
question.
Okay, you showed some very interesting graphs where you associated hypertension with lack of sleep,
Yes.
insufficient sleep. But then you're asserting it's a causal relationship.
No.
How can you be sure of that?
No, I cannot be sure at the moment. These are association studies. Thank you for highlighting that. Those are association studies. Although the hypertension, the obesity, the diabetes, the one I showed are association studies in a prospective fashion. So basically, that's the duration of sleep related to the future occurrence of hypertension. So that lack of sleep was predicting the proportion of people who would then develop hypertension in the following 5 years. Still is not a cause-effect relationship there. This may be a third factor. So I think what we need is intervention trials to show that if we modify the sleep duration on the long-term basis, we can modify the blood pressure and hypertension prevalence. That does not exist. Oh, absolutely not. And I'm not sure in some of these conditions we might ever get to the trial. It's similar to diet and nutrition and heart disease. Now, salt is bad for your blood pressure. No one has ever shown that if you eat less salt over your lifetime, you have a less stroke. It's impractical to do a trial. So you rely on second best evidence in the large studies. So the associations are very strong. For obesity, there is a mechanism very clear-cut. For the others are not. But these are coming up, all data of 2004, 2005, 2006. So this is an early stage, putting the lack of sleep in the population dimension. That's where we are particularly interested in. First, demonstrating in the UK that it's the same as the mostly American data. Second, what we want to do is try to explore some mechanisms, part of the hormones, but also there's more through inflammatory markers, activation of inflammation, and triggering of atherosclerosis, which is in our agenda, which I haven't mentioned. It's too specific for this audience, but exactly what we do.